Shalom, shalom. Brother Yatazadok, Hero Israel. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 10 breakdown. I want to give honor and glory to Yahweh by Hashem Yahushai. And double honors to the elders and apostles of GMS for teaching the truth of the Holy Scriptures. And feeding the lost sheep of Yahweh by Hashem Yahushai in truth and sincerity. And let's get right into it. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1. And it reads, Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea. Verse 2. And were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So what does Paul mean by baptized under the cloud, or Salakia, in the cloud and in the sea? Well, let's go into the precepts. It's the book of Exodus, chapter 19 and verse 10. Now, 1 Corinthians, now this chapter 10, is mainly touching on the what examples were given as far as the accounts pertaining to things that are transgressions as are outlined in the law. Things like idolatry and covetousness, and also committing fornication, whether it is physically or spiritually, because you can commit fornication with the other nations, physically through your seed, and also spiritually through the worship of their idols. Now, let's go to Exodus 19 and start at verse 10. So the point here is, before I move on, chapter 10, this is what it's mainly about. And also goes back, Paul is going back into the partaking of the idol and their sacrifices, and not to partake of those things. Now, because you have to keep in mind what he is admonishing the church of Corinth, even in the previous chapter. He's telling them, and we'll go over it, but what he mentioned specifically was in chapter 9 and verse 14, which is also outlined in the law, Leviticus 18 and 5. Those that live of the things of the temple and wait at the altar shall also partake of those things. Meaning, you gotta practice what you preach. But let's go to Exodus 19 and 10. And it reads, And the Lord Yahweh said unto Moses, Go unto the people, and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes. So this is one of several precepts where you get the concept of baptism. This is what Paul was loosely referencing in 1 Corinthians 10 and 2. Now let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 2. And I also brought out the that precept, Exodus 19 and 10, in the previous video, as pertaining to the works, the works that the rulers of the Jews they thought they were justified in doing the letter of the law and not keeping the spirit of the law, meaning keeping the letter, the law to a T, but were denying the whole purpose of the law, and the whole purpose that it was instituted for was to create an order and in the nation of Israel, which is the so-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans today. The 12 tribes, also known as the sons of Jacob, through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, which is where you get the 12 patriarchs. But the point here is that these were part of the works of the law that the rulers of the Jews they thought they were justified in. But Paul was not teaching this way. What he was doing, he was building up these various Jews and Israelite foreigners through the epistles and through the things that he taught in person. Building them up by giving them examples, constantly quoting the law and the prophets. And like I did the previous video, he was using examples to spark their interest, and also to get them to go back to the law so they can meditate on the things he was saying and compare it with the precepts contained in the law so they can understand the example that he was using. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians 10 and we'll move on down to verse 3, because this part isn't really too deep. 1 Corinthians 10 and 3, and did all eat the same spiritual meat. So the point here is, now you can use this to bring out a point, verse 1, to show you who these Church of Corinth, who they pertain to, as far as their patrimonial lineage, which goes back to the Israelites. Because Paul is saying all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. You got to keep in mind, these at the Church of Corinth were comprised of Israelite foreigners and practicing Jews and Gentiles. So he's not making a distinction here. What he's saying is he's speaking generally to these two groups. You got to keep in mind he's writing to two different groups in one epistle. He did not write separate epistles for separate groups because they were in the same congregation. So verse 2, so they were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Exodus 19 and 10. Verse 3, and did all eat the same spiritual meat. So verse 2 says they were all baptized in the cloud and in the sea. And they ate the same spiritual meat. So what is that spiritual meat? The law, statutes, and commandments. Let's go to Exodus chapter 20, verse 22. It's book of Exodus chapter 20, verse 22. And it reads, and the Lord Yahweh said unto Moses, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, ye have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. And that is the point. that they were baptized in the cloud and in the sea. They passed through the sea, which is as they were leaving Egypt, and they were baptized in the sea. And also, like the precept that I brought out, Exodus 19 and 10, they were ceremonially washing their clothes as Moses commanded them. And that spiritual meat is like I read here, Exodus 20 and 22, which pertain to the law, statutes, and commandments. If you read on down. Now, let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Go down to verse 4. So, Paul, what he's essentially doing, he's just bringing up the account of how the all the fathers that pertain to these Jews and these Israelite foreigners, they all went through that passed through that sea and partook of those things, meaning the law, statutes, and commandments, which was to set up the government of Israel, the 12 tribes, and establish them as they were entering into the promised land, preparing them and to set up an order, and ultimately an example unto all the nations for the time to come, according to what was promised to Abraham, that in these all nations shall be blessed, but that is after all things must come to pass, and there's got to be a certain the destruction has to come upon the land as it did before. And these other nations, they have to go and serve their and they got to pay their dues. They got to go into captivity. They have to, because every nation under the earth, under the heaven, had the nation of Israel in subjection in one way or another. So-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans. But the point here is that Paul starting off this chapter by giving them the example of that the forefathers, they all partook of the handing of the law through Moses during this time. So they all partook of that spiritual meat, which were the things that were commanded and written in the law. Verse 4, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Hamashiach. So that rock that followed them was also that the angel, which was sent and had the Father's name in him, which is ultimately Yahweh Mashiach. Now, let's go to Exodus chapter 23 and verse 20. Now, we're not going to get too deep on that, but just bring out a precept just to so we can go precept upon precept, here a little, there a little, line upon line. This book of Exodus chapter 23 and verse 20. And it reads, behold, I send an angel before thee to keep thee in the way, and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. Verse 21. Beware of him and obey his voice. Provoke him not, for he will not pardon your transgressions. For my name is in him. Because again, you have the Heavenly Father's name, Yahweh, and Yahweh Shai. Yahweh Shai meaning he delivers. He is the deliverer. But that was Exodus 23 and 20 and on down. So that was that spiritual rock that followed them and guided them in the way as they were entering into the land of Canaan, which was to be established as the promised allotted land to the nation of Israel, the nation of Yasharallah, the prince of the power, or he who has power with God. Now, let's read back in Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. So Paul is just bringing up that account and then going into the examples to which he's instructing those at this church at Corinth the things that they are to not follow after, and compelling them and to search these things out in the law, because you got to keep in mind during this time they had the measuring stick, which is the law and the prophets during this time, and they also had the things that Yahushua Mashiach taught that was handed down to Paul through Peter and the Lord's brother James, or Yaqub. But let's read down to verse 5. But with many of them the Most High was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Verse 6. Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Now lusting is also going into covetousness, which is as commanded as something to abstain from in the law. And it reads in verse 7, neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now let's go to the book of Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. Book of Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. And it reads, for whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. So these things were written for our learning, but you have to keep in mind they were things that were specifically written as instructions to those back then, and some things do apply to today, to us, that we can use and apply today. But there are things that were specifically written to be applied for those that were instructed during this time. Now we're going to distinguish that in the following precepts, and like it contains in the law. It says, you shall distinguish between the holy and the profane, between the clean and unclean, and vice versa, because we know the precepts in the law do not contain every single stipulation, but you can expound on what the meaning of the precept is if you're constantly meditating and using the examples in the accounts that were given and written before time for our understanding. Now let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Salakia, and verse 8. And it reads, neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Verse 9, neither let us tempt Hamashiach, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents. Verse 10, neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now, Paul is writing these things to the church of Corinth because he's compelling them to search them out and to meditate on these accounts as pertaining to these things that were recorded in the law. Now, verse 11. Now all these things happen unto them for in samples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Verse 12, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Now, this is what Paul is warning these various churches, not to repeat these things that have happened in the past, and how to compare these examples and line them up according to the precepts commanded in the law. Because there are things in the law that are um, righteous in the eyes of the Most High, like justice, mercy, loving your own people. And there are things that the Most High despises, like idolatry, worshiping of other gods. Because it says, Yahweh Hashem Yahushai, the Most High Power, is a jealous power. Now, just for time's sake, let's move on down. But this is the whole point of why Paul is writing of these various accounts. This is why it says in verse 12, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Verse 13, there had no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But the Most High is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Verse 14, wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. So this is the main key point that he's touching on in this chapter, which is idolatry and the worshiping of idols. And so he makes it clear to flee from idolatry, from the fornication, spiritual fornication that you commit, that one would commit with these idols. That's why he says flee from idolatry. And also he's like he spoke in the previous chapter. He spoke of him, Salakia, chapter 8. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 4. As concerning therefore the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. So Paul is making a distinction. He's saying that he's addressing the things, the eating of these sacrifices of flesh that were offered unto idols during the times of the Greeks and the Romans. These are things that pertain specifically to those back then. And it says, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, because an idol really is nothing. It is just a stock of wood, a stock of stone, and ultimately it's vanity created out of the imaginations of men. Now, let's move on down to verse 8. But meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. So the point here is that Paul is addressing those during this time that were eating meat that was sacrificed unto idols, whether they were eating of these meats that were offered unto idols, of these things that were sold in the marketplaces. And also there's another instance too, those that were actually partaking in the altar of the idol and eating of those sacrifices as they were partaking in the ceremony of the idol, whether they were doing it on their behalf, or whether they were um, they were invited by an unbeliever, like he mentions in this chapter. But the point here is, Paul is saying, he's not saying idolatry is okay. What he's saying is, if you're outside of these temples, these idols temples, and there's some items you purchase at the marketplace, and whether they're sacrificed to idols or not, whether you know that or not, to not ask, but just eat it, because ultimately idol is nothing, and the food offered to it is really just out of the imaginations of men. And those who know that an idol is nothing, they know that that which was offered unto that idol is ultimately nothing, because the Most High created everything. Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, Bashem Rakakodash, ultimately Heavenly Father made all these things, whether they be a stock of wood, a stock of rock, whether it be flesh. So the point here is, Paul is addressing the things offered unto idols, saying whether you eat or not doesn't make a difference. But he's saying in verse 9, but take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block to them that are weak, because he's saying mainly addressing these Jews, practicing Jews in these congregations, because they had this knowledge. They were aware that an idol is nothing. But you had these Israelite foreigners that were caught up in these Roman Greek customs, that their mind was already polluted by all these philosophies and doctrines of men, that an idol could actually speak, and these other um, foolish things that these Romans and Greeks taught, that there was a somebody under the earth, and Hades, and all this nonsense. So which is ultimately, all these things are out of our imaginations of men, and they're not real. But God is real, and there is one creator, and that's the whole point. And these idols, mainly of these other nations, they're all just vanity, and it's all worthless, and will not save them in the time of their calamity. But the point here is, Paul is saying that it doesn't matter if you eat the things offered unto an idol, and he's talking about clean animals. He's not talking about pork. He's not saying it's okay to eat pork, because he would have said that. But the point here is he's addressing the things offered unto idols. He's saying an idol is nothing, whether you eat or not doesn't make a difference. But it says in verse 10, for if any man see thee which has knowledge sit at meat at the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? So for example, you have a practicing Jew. He's using this example. The one who has knowledge is the practicing Jew, because these Israelite foreigners were coming into the fold during this time. They weren't learned in the law and the prophets. They weren't aware that an idol is really an imagination and the creation of men. So Paul is using the example, the practicing Jews in the temple sitting at meat and partaking in the sacrifice and ultimately the worship of the idol. Because if you're in the idol's temple, then you're ultimately partaking not just in the eating of the things sacrificed to it, but you're also partaking in idolatry, which Paul is making it clear in chapter 10 that this is wrong. So what he's saying here in chapter 8 and verse 10, he's making that distinction, because if the practicing Jew was here in this idol's temple, partaking, and the Israelite foreigner sees him partaking of it, Paul is saying he's just gonna cause that Israelite foreigner who was returning back to the former covenants and customs, he's gonna think that it's okay to keep in the worshiping and the partaking of these idols in their temples, which was a common practice among these Romans and Greeks. So this is why you read the scriptures precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little, to get the proper understanding. Now, let's go back to actually, let's read verse 13. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. So, verse 10, he says, for if any man, so he's using an example. He's not using a realistic, this didn't actually happen. This is why you have to constantly be meditating in the scriptures, not just in the law, but in these in examples written for our learning. Because you had those at this time, they were given examples from the law and the prophets. Now we have the law and the prophets, the things Yahushua and Mashiach taught in the epistles. But the point here is that this is an example that Paul was using, and this is the understanding is clear even for us today. Now we know that there's no idol temples here today, openly and in society. And as far as things sold in the marketplaces that we can purchase, there's a more clear distinction and a wider selection as far as things that we can eat that are available, and compared to during this time the Greeks and the Romans, where the practice of worshiping these idols and offering sacrifice to idols was a common practice. So we can distinguish and separate the things that were written specifically for those back then, and we can make a difference between the or make a distinction between the things that were written for back then and things that we can take out of it and things that we can apply for today. And this gives us the proper doctrine. So we can't take these precepts and say, well, this is talking about clean and unclean foods. Because as you can see in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he's saying, and now let's go back to that. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. And he also brings out all the other examples written in the law. And he's telling them, don't be idolaters, don't lust after evil things. Don't commit fornication, which is all going into his point that he's making here. And not to tempt Hamashiach and the Most High. And because these are all things out of the law. And he ends it with flee from idolatry, because he's addressing the things that he previously wrote in the earlier chapters of the epistle, addressing things sacrifice unto idols and the partaking of the idol's temple. Now let's read on. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 15. I speak as to wise men. Judge ye what I say. Now, these wise men that he's speaking to are these Jews in these congregations, these practicing Jews, because you got to keep in mind, they were learned in the law. They were keeping the law not the way they should have, because they were keeping it the way that the elders and the rulers of the Jews were teaching them. But they still had knowledge of the law. They had the knowledge that an idol was nothing, and that Yahweh Bashim Yahushai Bashim Kodash created and made everything, and everything is of the Lord's creation. So these are the wise men he's speaking to, and he says, "Judge ye what I say," because all these things that he was bringing out as examples that he says are examples, meaning to the Church of Corinth, and ends it with flee from idolatry. So he's talking to these Jews, and he was telling them, "Judge the things that I say," because as they judged the things that he was saying, as they read these things, they were to go to these Israelite foreigners in the same congregation and give them the proper edification and build them up in the proper way. And that proper way would be to let them know this is the distinction Paul is making. He's saying that an idol is nothing. It's just an imagination. It's just a stock of wood, stock of stone, whatever the case may be. Whether you eat of this thing sacrificed to an idol, that doesn't make a difference whether you eat or you don't. And now keep in mind, he's talking about a clean food, clean animal, because it doesn't say unclean, clean. It doesn't say pork. It's a distinction without a difference. So the point here is that he's speaking to these wise men, which is the Jews in these congregations that knew the law, so they can edify their Israelite foreigner counterparts and let them know this is what Paul is saying. An idol is nothing. The Most High, He created everything. Whether you eat or not, these things, whether they're sold in the shambles, doesn't make a difference, because the Most High made all these things. Now the example he gave in chapter 8 and verse 10, he made it clear here in chapter 10 and verse 14 that that's not okay, as far as the account he brought up in chapter 8 and verse 10. If any man see thee which has knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? So he's saying this is not okay, because he clearly says in chapter 10 verse 14, flee from idolatry. And he's speaking to the wise men, meaning those who were learned in the law in these various congregations, starting with those in the Church of Corinth. He said, judge the things that I'm saying, because with those things you're saying, like he said in chapter 9 and verse 11, if we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? Because he's sowing onto these Jews here in chapter 10 and verse 15. He's sowing spiritual things to them, so for the purpose that they can reap the proper works that they are to not just themselves keep, so they do not defile the conscience of these Israelite foreigners that are getting built up alongside them in Yahweh Shai Mashiach through the Rakah Kodash and in the belief of the Most High back into the former covenants customs. So the point here is he's speaking to these Jews and telling them, look, judge the things that I'm saying, so that when I sow these spiritual things unto you, Paul and these other ministers, they were ultimately and these alongside these Jews, they're going to reap these carnal things, which are the works. And the works are the things that you show through your belief. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 15, I speak as to wise men, judge ye what I say. And he's going to go back into the topic of the idol and partaking in the Lord's table or in the idol's table, and what is okay, what is not okay. So that, like he addressed in verse 15, addressing the practicing Jews in these congregations so they can build up their Israelite foreigner counterparts. Because this is the whole purpose of chapters 8, 9, and 10. This is why he said in chapter 9 and 13, Do ye know not that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers at the altar? So he's making the point here, along with verse 14. If you're doing these things, you gotta actually live what you're teaching, so you can be that proper example. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 16, and it reads, The cup of blessing which we bless is not the communion of the blood of Hamashiach. The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Hamashiach? Now, the cup of the blessing, that is, and the communion was the gathering together of these practicing Jews and these Israelite foreigners under the belief of Hamashiach Yahushai. And the bread was that like Yahushua Mashiach said, I am that bread of life, and that's going to the scriptures. Now, you got the cup, which is the water, and the bread, which both symbolize the law, the scriptures as a whole, and the communion of the body of Hamashiach. Now, the blood of Hamashiach is what Hamashiach Yahushai. To put it simply, the purpose for him being that living sacrifice was to be for forgiveness of sins, to justify these Jews and these Israelite foreigners and things that they couldn't be justified, like these Israelite foreigners who had left their former covenants and customs and missed certain feast days. So they were to be cut off from Israel, and so on and so forth. This is just one of many examples. But through Hamashiach Yahushai, they were granted back into the fold. And also, the communion of the body of Hamashiach was these Israelite foreigners and these Jews gathering together. But that's not the main point that I want to touch on. The main point in this chapter, even chapter 8, 9, and 10, is Paul's addressing the things offered unto idols and partaking in the idol's temple, or partaking in the Lord's table. And he's making a distinction as we read on. Verse 17, For we, being many, are one bread, and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread, meaning of the law, statutes, and commandments. And like he said in verse 1, he said, All our fathers were under the cloud and passed through the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat. Now, this is why you can use that water and bread, and it all goes back to the scriptures. Paul's making a point that all the fathers, whether they were these Israelite foreigners, the fathers of these Israelite foreigners, or these practicing Jews, they all partook of that covenant, that oath, that binding agreement, that they had to keep the law and do the things that they were instructed. So he's making the distinction as far as the body. What is the body of Hamashiach, and what is the body of the partaker of the idol? Now, Let's read verse 17 again. For we, being many, are one bread and one body. For we are all partakers of that one bread, meaning the law, statutes, and commandments, that oath, that binding covenant, the blood covenant, which was through the forefathers and handed down through the generations of the children. Verse 18, behold, Israel after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? Now, you see the same thing happening today. You have some of our people after that flesh, and the flesh is a representation of the things of this world, the lust of the eyes, the vanities of one's mind, and material gain. And these are ultimately, it's 2/3 of our people that are after these tangible things. And it reads, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? So those of our people who despise correction, despise reproof, despise walking in the ways of Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Rakakodash, these are the people that are after the flesh. And Paul is using an example, saying, behold, Israel after the flesh, because there was Israelite foreigners during this time, which did not return to the former covenants and customs. You had the Jews, the rulers of the people, who were also considered Israel after the flesh. Why? Because they loved the worship of men and the glory of men more than the glory of God. And it reads, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? So you have our people today and those back then that were eating of the sacrifices, more literal back then than today, because like I was saying, these idolatry and these temples were more common back then. Now they're still here today in some form or fashion, but the point here is that these things are also happening today. And back then they were eating the sacrifices because they were partaking of that same idolatry, of that same temple. And even today, our people sell out, and they partake in these holidays and literal idolatry, whatever the case may be. The observing of these paganistic holidays and paganistic ways. So that's not okay. And Paul's making a point here. And these are things that we can take and apply today. And it reads, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? Verse 19, what say I then? That the idol is anything? Or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? And the answer is la'ah, because he already said that the idol is nothing. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And verse 4. Now Salakia. See, where was I? So the idol is nothing, and the thing which is sacrificing to idols is nothing also. But the point is, he's making a distinction. He said, flee from idolatry, and of course that applies for us today. Now, let's read on down. Verse 20. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. and I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. Now, he's talking about these Greek Roman customs back then that they had set up in these various temples and offering up sacrifices to them. So he's saying, do not have fellowship with such works. This is why he used the example 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, because this was an example, hypothetical. He was speaking hypothetically. This didn't actually happen. Now, let's go back to chapter 10 and let's read on down to verse 21. It reads, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils." Now we can take that and apply it today, because you can't partake in these heathenish ways, these paganistic customs, because that is partaking in the cup of devils, and that's contrary to righteousness. And the things that the Most High has told us to separate ourselves from, like it says in the book of Revelation, "Come out here, my people," and you start off through coming out of those philosophies, those doctrines and commandments of men, the imaginations of these idols and these false gods. Now, it reads, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils." So he's also making it clear during this time, you can't partake in the cup of Yahweh Hashem Yahushai and at the same time be in the idol's temple. Because he said, "Flee from idolatry." Verse 22, "Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?" So he's essentially saying, this is why it's not okay to be in these idols, in the temples of the idol, even though we know that the idol is nothing, that the meat offered unto idols is nothing. But are we going to tempt the Most High? Are we going to provoke him to jealousy? Are we stronger than that than to abstain from these idol temples and these ceremonies that were going on during this time? This is what he's saying to the church of Corinth. Because you're not to make your brother to offend, but at the same time, you can't, he's making it clear, you can't be in these temples and these idols' temples, in the temple of the idol. Because that is contrary to righteousness. Verse 23, "All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not." Now, all things are lawful. He's speaking on the that the meat offered unto idols, that it doesn't matter if you eat it or not. But if you're partaking of the idol's temple, you're partaking in that idolatry. So he's going to make another point here and make a distinction. So it's not okay to be in the idol's temple, because if you're in the idol's temple, you're partaking in the activities of the idol's temple, and so ultimately you're going off, is what he's saying. Now, it may be expedient for it to be okay to eat what is offered unto an idol, but does that mean it's okay to partake to be in the idol's temple? It's not okay. That's what Paul is saying. And he's going to make a point as to why he's bringing these hypotheticals up. Verse 24, Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. So he's saying to these Jews and these Israelite foreigners, don't seek your own ways, but seek into a way to where you can edify one another. Verse 25. And Salaki, before I move on, this is why he said in chapter 9, verse 27, but I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. And also he said to the weak, chapter 9, verse 22, to the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So this is, you can apply this today. This is why, you see certain camps, they're praying, prophesying, covering their head with their head covered. Although that's not an actual law, you shouldn't create a stumbling block on your people. If you're claimed to be a teacher in Israel, this is how you become all things to all men. Even though you know better, but you have to become all things to all men of your own people. Those that are keeping the law, those that are coming back into the faith. Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Kakodash. This is what that means. It doesn't mean that it's okay to partake even today in well, actually, I'm not going to use the examples for today, because the point here is that Paul in chapter 8, 9, and 10, he's addressing the temple, being in the temple of the idol, eating the things offered unto an idol, and offending and things that do not edify your fellow believer. Like he says in 1 Corinthians 8 and 11, and through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. Because you're gonna further pollute the conscience and of your weak brother. So you're not supposed to do this even today. But the point here is, these are the things that Paul is addressing. Partaking in the idol's temple, eating meat offered unto an idol, and eating meat offered unto an idol while you're in the temple. And then he says, like he says in chapter 10, flee from idolatry. So you're not supposed to partake in the idol's temple. And he's going to tell you why he said it's okay to eat, that it doesn't matter if you eat, if you don't, of things sacrificed to idols. Verse 25. Whatsoever is sold in the shambles that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. Now he's actually addressing food sacrifice unto idols. And this is mainly applies to those back then. Because it was you got to remember, they were under the Romans. And the things weren't as available as they are today. And this is not talking about you can't apply this to today and say, well, whatever is sold, whether it be pork, whatever be clean, unclean, eat, ask no question for conscience sake. That's not what that's talking about. This is why you can't take all things and apply them to today and make a whole doctrine out of it, or take your understanding out of one precept and think that's what it's and think it applies to today, when this is mainly for those to whom it was written during this time. And this is talking about food sacrificed to idols. If you go precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little. This is what chapter 8, chapter 9, and this chapter is going into. He does talk about other things, but the point here is, the sum of the matter is this. He talks about chapters 8, 9 through 10, things sacrificed to idols, not making your brother offend, not defiling the conscience of your weak brother, and also um, eating things sacrificed to idols. So he's saying, verse 25, whatever is sold in the shambles, that eat, no asking no question for conscience sake. So it's, if these what he's addressing is meat sold onto sacrifice unto idols. He's saying that whatever is sold to you, eat. It doesn't matter if it was sacrificed unto an idol. But he's talking about clean food. He's not talking about pork. He's not saying eat, asking a question for conscience sake to those back then. This was something that was lawful to eat, that was permitted in the dietary law, but it was offered unto an idol. But it was okay to eat because the idol ultimately is nothing. And so this is what he's saying. Now let's move on. Verse 26. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Because that's true. How about Shem Yahushai created everything? Now let me see if I can get a precept real quick. It's the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 5 and verse 9. And it reads, moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. So the point here is that Yahweh Shem Yahushai, he created all things for man to consume, whether it be beast or plant. And these idols were just the imaginations of men. So that's the point Paul is making in 1 Corinthians 10. And verse 25. Now verse 27. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 27. If any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, and ye be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you, eat, asking no question for conscience sake. Because you have to keep in mind, this is another hypothetical that Paul is using. This didn't actually happen. You can't apply this to today. And this is talking about those that believe not was these Romans and these Greeks, because you got to keep in mind Israel was still under subjection during this time. Whether you were a practicing Jew or an Israelite foreigner coming out of the ways of the Greeks and the Romans, you still at one point in time had to be disposed to go to these places. Because you have to keep in mind, some Israelites were free during this time. Some were in bondage. Like Paul said in chapter 9 and verse 1. 1 Corinthians 9 and 1. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? So he's talking about these other nations, these Romans and these Greeks. He's saying if any of them believe not, bid you to a feast, and you be disposed to go, meaning you're one way or another, sort of pushed or forced to go. Whatever set before you, eat, asking no question for conscience sake, as far as things pertaining to things sacrificed unto idols. So he's saying amongst these other nations, the Romans and the Greeks, they bid you to a feast, and you're pressured to go. Whatever set before you, eat. Ask no question. Verse 28, but if any man say unto you, meaning any of your other brethren, not of the other nations, if any of your people say unto you, this is offered in sacrifice unto idols. So again, he's talking about food sacrificed unto idols. He's not talking about any food, clean or unclean. This is clearly talking about one thing from chapter 8, chapter 9 to this chapter. It says, eat not for his sake that shoot it, and for conscience sake. The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. Didn't I just read that in Ecclesiastes 5 and 9? So he's saying, if you're so you don't defile the the conscience of your brother. Don't eat it, even though you know that the Most High made the earth and everything in it. Verse 29, conscience I say, not thine own, but of the others. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? Because you got to understand that these were instructions pertaining to this time, because these things were more prominent during this time. The temple of the idol, eating the sacrifice of things offered unto idols. And it says, conscience I say, not thine own, but of the others. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? So it reads verse 30, for if I by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of? For that which I give thanks. So Paul's saying, although it's not your conscience, but another man's conscience, and your liberty is now being taken away because of your fellow believer's conscience. Although you blessed it, although you did a prayer over it, and you know that an idol is nothing. Because at the end of the day, this is another hypothetical. Verse 27 is saying, if any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, because and you had to be disposed to go at one point in time during this time. Not today. So it reads verse 30, for if I by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of? For that for which I give thanks. Verse 31, whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of the Most High Yahweh. Verse 32, give none offense, neither to the Jews, meaning to your own people, the practicing Jews, neither to the Gentiles. And this is addressing the Romans and the Greeks. Nor to the church of God, which is these Israelite foreigners. So he's saying, look, during this time, we're still under subjection. Don't willingly go to the idol's temple and partake in it. But if you're in the market, buy what you got to buy. If it's sold into idol, it doesn't matter. Ask no question and buy it for conscience sake. But he said here, 1 Corinthians 10:27, if any of them that don't believe, meaning of these other nations, Romans and the Greeks during this time, if they bid you and you're disposed to go, meaning you're basically forced to go, just eat whatever is set before you. Ask no question, just like the things sold in the shambles. But if your brother say unto you, this is offered unto idols, don't eat it. So this is how you're building each other up. This is what Paul was teaching in these various congregations. And he ends it with, give none offense, neither to the Jews, neither to the practicing Jews, nor to the Gentiles, these other nations, Romans and the Greeks, nor to the Israelite foreigners. Like he said in chapter 8 and chapter 9. First Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 11. And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. First Corinthians chapter 9 and 22. We're actually to the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Verse 27. But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. Now, this is why he said, Salakia. Verse 24. Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth, meaning to build each other up. Not his own mind, not his own conscience, but in the building up and the edification, whether it be doctrine, whether it be in your action, showing your works through your faith, or whether you're sowing spiritual things unto those in these various congregations, which is what Paul is saying. Like he said in chapter 9, and verse 11, if we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things, meaning your works that are ultimately manifest through the spiritual things that you sow to your fellow believer? First Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 33. Even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Now, I think that pretty much brought the point on this chapter. And like I said, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10 goes hand in hand. Is Brother Yatazadak, hero Israel. Again, giving all honor and glory to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Rakakwadash. Giving double honors to the elders and apostles GMS and those who came before them, teaching the truth and sincerity. Kwam Yasharala, Shalom.